All right, the clock has, for me, struck 8:05, and so we've given people a few minutes to join. Again, I'm sure more people will join as we progress through the next hour or so, but I get the opportunity today to talk to some old friends and colleagues and have them share some of their expertise with you. Again, Joel Brennan, I'm the head of the Greater Milwaukee Committee, really appreciative of those who have joined us today from our membership and our colleagues and the people around the Milwaukee community who work with us. And as I was thinking about today and my former colleague, Secretary of the Department of Revenue, Peter Barca, my thoughts went back to the period of maybe April and May of 2020, just after we had kind of had the initial shock of COVID-19 and all that had happened in those few months. And I can tell you that I was at that time the Secretary of the Department of Administration. Peter was in his role as the Secretary of the Department of Revenue. And we were quite likely the least popular people inside state government at that time, because the governor requested to us, people can, I think, appreciate and recall what the situation was like in your own homes, in your businesses, in your communities. But I think we were the least popular people because we were charged by the governor of going to every agency, large and small, as large as the UW system, as small as the smallest agency inside state government, and saying to them, look, we have to tighten our belts. And in the way the state operates its budget, it's a a biennial budget. And so we were coming to the end of the first year. And for most of you who are in business, you have spent most of your money by the end of the business year. And we went to them and we said, we need you to provide, I think it was 10% of cuts of all of your discretionary revenue, your discretionary spending in the last 8 or 9 weeks of the fiscal year. And so that was not an easy thing to do. It didn't make us popular. We saved at that point about $70 million to give the state a good cushion heading into the next fiscal year. And at that point, we also had serious conversations about whether we were going to have to access the state's rainy day fund. At that point, it was about $600 million. And, were things going to be so challenging? The state has to meet it. It has an obligation to meet all of its costs. And were we going to have to dip into that? Well, that was in April, May of 2020. And I think everybody understands that some dramatic things have happened since then, and even in just a few months after that. The COVID-19 recession was not as widespread as we had initially feared. It hurt specific industries, and there was some federal support, first under the Trump administration, then under the Biden administration, that provided some direct support to businesses that were really hurting, and the economy rebounded. And I'm sure Peter's going to want to give the governor an appropriate amount of credit for that. Certainly he would get the blame if things were different, but it also is a testament and a credit to the resilience of the Wisconsin economy, Wisconsin businesses, and everybody who kind of turned the corner on that. And I think people know now that the situation, the state's fiscal picture, is as bright as it's ever been. He'll tell you about the record amount that's in the state's rainy day fund, a $5 billion surplus, and all that could potentially mean moving forward. Now, a couple of Peter's colleagues will also talk about the local option sales tax and the fiscal picture here, because I can tell you now, having been in this role for 9 months, having left state government, being at the GMC, I've had a front row seat to the real challenges that the city of Milwaukee faces, Milwaukee County, and that those challenges and the wolf is at the door now, and that there has to be dramatic action, most likely in the step towards more flexibility for generating local revenue through a sales tax in Milwaukee County. And that's something that we at the GMC and our partners at the MMAC, the City of Milwaukee, Milwaukee County, others in this broad coalition will be working on over the next few months. And the state's fiscal picture allows us and affords us an opportunity to talk to them about the ways that they can be our partner and need to be our partner in that. Because again, the situation is dramatically different here at the City of Milwaukee. The contract through the state shared revenue program, which has existed for about 110 years, is pretty much fundamentally broken, not just with Milwaukee, but with 1,800 units of government around the state. And so we need the state to be our partner in that. We've talked to the Republicans in the legislature. We met with the Democrats in the legislature just yesterday, a number of us. So we really need this to be part of the conversation. We need our partners and the people in the GMC to be part of that conversation, but it's about arming you with the knowledge and giving you an idea of where things really stand. And that's where Peter Barca, my colleague, my former colleague, who's the Secretary of the Department of Revenue, comes in. Peter is a former state legislator. He served in this role for now almost 4 years. He served as a member of Congress, did 2 stints in the state assembly, and also hails from the city of Kenosha. You'll never find anybody who's prouder to be from and of Kenosha, and somebody who I was really proud to call colleague and still proud to call friend. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Secretary of the Department of Revenue, Peter Barca, to lead us through the discussion. Peter?
Well, thank you so much, Joel, and that's just a terrific overview, and we're so pleased, myself and my colleagues, to be with you all, to be able to talk about just sort of the state of the economy. What does the fiscal position of the state actually look like, and what can we be counting on as we move forward? I've got a couple of colleagues with me. Emily Camfield, she'll go next. She's one of our lead macroeconomists in the state. The Department of Revenue, many people necessarily don't think of, but we have the largest number of economists to be able to project where the economy is going, to have a picture of what revenue forecasts look like so that we can advise the governor and advise policymakers and actually make business leaders like you all aware of where we're at fiscally. And then she'll be followed by John Dickard. He heads our state and local finance. So this issue that Joel talks about in terms of trying to ensure that Milwaukee County, the city of Milwaukee, are all in the strongest possible health. That's what he wakes up worrying about every day. So we'll have some terrific data on that as well. And I'll try to go relatively quickly through my slides so that we can have time at the end for questions that people may have, or ideas or items that you want to bring up. But as we move forward to the next slide, the good news is as you look at Milwaukee's needs, and we can't speak to the state of the national economy. Obviously, Wisconsin, any more than our neighbors in Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, or Michigan, can't control the national picture. But from what we can control in the state, I have only good news to share. We're in the strongest fiscal health we've been in a half a century. So there's really no reason why we can't become much stronger in helping local units of government. We've had major tax relief, which is obviously a huge plus. It helps to make our economy stronger when you can provide relief so that money is rippling through the economy. We've had a tax rate drop amongst the largest in the nation. In fact, it was the largest in state history in real dollars and close to that in nominal dollars. Equalized values are breaking records. That's also good. That means that the property that, whether it's individuals or businesses own, they're worth more money. We run the lottery. We call it our entertainment division. And we have the largest property tax credit ever in our 33-year history, just a sign of the times. We're in the best fiscal position in a half century. And I'm going to talk a little bit about infrastructure investments and how important all of that is. But it was interesting. We'll move on to the next slide. It's interesting to listen to Joel because it seems like that was 10 years ago we went through the heart of the pandemic when there was just such concern about what would our fiscal picture look like a year from now. And we were all obviously extremely concerned, as were businesses. Both of my parents were entrepreneurs and I owned a business. So we're always very sensitive, the Department of Revenue, to businesses. So real quickly, I'd like to at least let you know, where does the tax money come from that the state of Wisconsin has? And then where does it go? So that you can see where your tax money is going as well. So starting off, you can see that by far the largest amount of money that we collect in the state is in individual income taxes. It represents almost 44.8% of the revenue we bring in. Sales tax is by far the second highest. It's over a third at 34%. People are oftentimes surprised. They think of corporate income as high, and it is an important contribution at 14.4%, but it is third. Fourth is excise taxes. That's mainly tobacco and alcohol, and you can see so on down the line, but over 90% of the taxes come from what we call the big three. Moving on to the next slide. On the expenditure side of the equation, people are oftentimes surprised to learn that 2/3 of the money that we bring in the state of Wisconsin goes right back out the door. By far, the most amount of money that we have goes out in school aids. That's what funds K-12 education. Of course, Wisconsin has always had a tradition of quality education. And you can see that well over a third, 36.7%, goes to fund our K-12 education in Wisconsin. Next up is medical assistance. That's what helps senior citizens in nursing homes, people with disabilities, people with fragile health concerns. Very important, obviously. I'm going to come back to the third one, but the fourth highest one is state property tax relief. All those credits that you see in your property taxes, that comes out of the state in terms of direct support to property owners. The largest expense by the state is correctional services. That's at 7.5%. About 5 or 6 years ago, we surpassed the UW system, which is the next highest. Those are the two largest state expenditure of funds directly. The UW at 6.6%. And then you go right back to money going back out, share of revenue, the tech college, community aids, individual tax relief, supplement to SI. So going back up to the 14 or to the 15%, that funds all of state government, absent corrections and UW, whether it's roads, whether it's the DNR and clean water, whether it's the Department of Revenue, children and families. So you can see that almost all the money we take in does go right back out the door. Next slide. In terms of tax relief, we had, as I indicated, the largest tax cut in state history in real dollars and one of the very largest in nominal dollars. $2 billion in individual income tax relief over the course of the biennium. I think that's been another part of our recovery, along with all the various pandemic dollars that were spent that I'll talk about later. 2.4 million filers relief tax relief as a result of the budget bill. And that's out of only 3 million tax filers. On average, an average family is getting about $800 more in tax relief as a result of the budget and some of the other tax provisions that we passed. And obviously, wage earners are keeping more of their money in their paycheck. When the governor ran, he ran on the plan of giving a 10% income tax cut to Wisconsin, to middle-class Wisconsinites in particular, but for all Wisconsinites. And you can see we more than exceeded that at 15%, 50% more for 86% of all taxpayers. Next slide. These other items of tax relief are also very important, equally important in some ways. 2/3 funding of education, the governor being a former superintendent of schools, that was one of his highest priorities. We have not done that since Governor Tommy G. Thompson was governor. So you can see for 40 long years, we were not giving that kind of support. And that's very important, both for educational outcomes, as well as to try and help senior citizens and people on fixed incomes to be able to stay in their home. The next three are very important, not only just for tax relief, but also for workforce. And at the start of the pandemic, workforce was the largest issue. And then it's once again largely become the biggest issue in Wisconsin again. 72 million in over the biennium for tech college. That went both for property tax relief as well as workforce training. The next one you might not think of as a workforce issue, but I can assure you it is. And when you hear from Emily Canfield, you'll see some of the data points on this. But what our economists would tell you, first of all, there's very few people sitting on the sidelines. I think people are shocked to hear. Most Wisconsinites are ambitious people that are all out working. But the ones that are, a large percentage of those are people with children, particularly infants, where childcare is so expensive. So the governor made it a priority to try and get to 50% of the federal credit, because that changes the equation to make it a better deal for parents to be able to go back to work if childcare is made more affordable through the tax code. And then finally, something we've worked on for decades, being a legislator, as Joel indicated, I was a minority leader for most of my last tenure in the legislature, and we worked very closely with veterans groups. But this was a priority of General Knapp, the head of the National Guard, and as well as all the various veterans groups. And why is this a workforce issue? Because to exempt all active duty military pay, it's a right thing to do for men and women in uniform, but also it's a right thing to do because that way, what they've told us is they'll maintain their citizenship in Wisconsin, which makes it far more likely when they complete their military service, they'll move back to Wisconsin. So these are all very important provisions for workforce as well as for tax purposes. Next slide. Generally speaking, and it actually comes to the discretion of the Department of Revenue, So the Secretary of Revenue makes this decision, but usually in consultation with the governor. And what we did is we changed the withholding tables. Now, people can withhold whatever they'd like, actually, but most people take the standard. But by by changing the withholding table so people keep more of their money, then it ripples through the economy, and that's worked well as an economic stimulus in addition. Next slide. Governor Evers, had a plan for a special session. As you can see, the legislature almost never comes back in a special session during an election year. Much to my chagrin as a minority leader, every single year when we started our session on the calendar, I would have an amendment to have a period in the fall so that when needs came up, we would have a date already set to come back in the session. And for whatever reason, I could never convince them to do it. But so that less than 2 weeks before the election, they probably will not come back. But this will give you a preview of things that you'll see in the next budget. And one is to have a 10% tax cut for working families. With inflation being high, this will obviously help working families to be able to afford gas and other increasing costs that they have as a result of inflation in the supply chain. Homestead credit, vitally important. In fact, I'll just a quick vignette here. My most poignant moment as Secretary of Revenue was in February when I first started a couple months into my term. I was going to the Milwaukee office for the first time. It was the first day of tax filing, and it was an absolute blizzard. It was like 15 below zero. On days like that, state workers can decide whether to come in or not, and about half decided to come in, half took leave time. But after I'd been in the office for about an hour and a half, all of a sudden people came in. We had a line down the hallway at the state office building, and I went around shaking hands, thanks for coming, but why would you be out in this weather? And people say, oh, the homestead credit, I've got to get my homestead credit in, because you can actually get your money back immediately on the homestead credit. And this is for people of more modest income. Governor would like to increase that to $35,000 so more people would qualify. Very important provision though, for people of limited income to be able to afford all the daily expenses that people have. Next one, the number one priority for disabled vets, one of the top 3 priorities for every veterans group, and that's to allow for veterans and surviving spouses to get help on a property tax credit. Right now, you have to be 100% disabled, which few people are. Even people seriously injured, they might mark them as 80 or 90% disabled. This is something veterans groups are pushing us to do. Eliminate the gasoline minimum markup law. This is also, would help to bring down gas prices. We have competition now, the governor feels, and amongst various retailers, and this could bring down gas as much as 20 cents a gallon. For medically sensitive people who have to use insulin, every state around us caps the share of insulin at $35. So this is something the governor has been pushing for, is to do the same here in Wisconsin. Also, I mentioned earlier about the 100% federal credit and a caregiving credit for those who take care of disabled or elderly people. Next slide. The good news is that Wisconsin has improved its position enormously over the course of the last 20 years. And this is a good bipartisan victory because we've had Democratic governors, Republican legislatures, Democratic legislatures over a 20-year period. But you can see that in 1999, we were ranked 4th in the country in terms of the load that you have for state and local taxes. We now are 18th in the country, and actually we're 31st if you look at fees as well, which is the same as a tax, essentially. So, we're right in the middle. It's a good place to be. It makes us more competitive in terms of retaining businesses here in southeastern Wisconsin and throughout Wisconsin, and attracting new businesses. So, very important. And then as a percentage of personal income, we went down from 10.3% in 2018 to 10.07%. So we continue to shrink, and that's going to continue to improve our competitiveness. Next slide. The other really important news, because of course, Wisconsin's always been known for a quality workforce, and that's that once again, our public schools are in the top 10 once again. We had drifted almost to being only in the top 20 to now being 8th. In terms of quality, we're ranked 5th. We're tied with Minnesota for the highest SAT scores, and pupil-teacher ratios have come down lower than the U.S. average. So that's another good sign that things are turning around. Next slide. Equalized values. Now this is, I'm not going to go through each element here. You can read the slide, but just suffice it to say, this shows that values are improving dramatically in Wisconsin. And for the residential market value, there was a robust increase of 15%. That's a positive sign in terms of the vibrancy of the Wisconsin market. Next slide. I won't spend as much time on this, but if my lottery professionals were here, they would tell me to remind you all that they don't call us Wisconsin, they call us Wisconsin, because we're an average size state. We buy an average number of tickets, but we're 7th in the nation in terms of winning. So if you're going to buy a lottery ticket, don't buy in Illinois or Minnesota, get it right here in Wisconsin. But the most important point here is that in our 33-year history of the lottery, we give up the largest ever distribution, meaning the property tax credit was the highest ever. And when we created the lottery, that was the point. I guess I sound ancient talking about it, but I was there when we created it. And the idea was to give property tax relief. Next slide. As I indicated, and Emily Canfield will go next, will probably have more data on this, but and as Joel mentioned, we're on track to have over a $5 billion surplus come June 30th of 2023. We already are well over $4 billion. For those of you that are sort of CPA or finance geeks, even using the gap balance for the first time ever, we have a surplus. And as Joel also indicated, our rainy day fund is chock full. The statutes allow for up to 5%. So we have the maximum of 1.7 billion. That's over and above the $5 billion surplus that's projected. Next slide. The state fiscal health is also well represented by our bond rating. And this was one of the things I enjoyed enormously, along with Joel when he was Secretary of Administration. And of course, the governor leads the team. But it was great to hear the feedback. And for the first time in 40 years, we have a AAA bond rating here in Wisconsin based on Kroll. And we improved our S&P from a AA to a AA plus. And I have to say, living in the Kenosha-Racine area, I always have to chuckle because I see the political ads and I see Governor Pritzker saying that, and Illinois has improved its bond rating. We're now at a BB. I don't know if we've ever been that bad at a BB, but anyway, it's nice to be in the kind of fiscal position we're in. Next slide. The Badger bounce back, Joel alluded to this too. And this is something that, as Joel kind of alluded to, we had daily cabinet meetings for months on end to figure out, the governor's strategy, which was to try to get money back to farmers and small businesses and community-based organizations so they would survive at the other end of the pandemic. And it worked well, as you'll see from the slides Emily Canfield will show you. But in all, we actually have 3,000 more businesses now than we had at the start of the pandemic. We got $100 million of Wisconsin farmers through the Wisconsin Farm Support. At DOR, we were very fortunate to be able to administer many of these grant programs. And I know as I get around the state, I always stop at small businesses and farmers and others to ask how it's gone. And we've gotten very positive feedback because being a member of the WDC board, we're always looking for ways to make grant processes more easy to administer and more importantly, easy for businesses to be able to qualify. Next slide. In all, we've given over $1 billion in direct support to small businesses, farmers, the tourism industry, and that puts us amongst the elite in the country. I think we were number one for a while, and we're still one of the top. The Main Street bounce back, I kind of alluded to that earlier, but it's surprising how people have taken advantage of this. I was with the chamber directors from all over the state in Eau Claire just a couple of weeks ago, and they just raved about how easy it's been to use the Main Street bounce back and what a difference it made in their downtown areas. And I know Secretary Missy Kincaid from WDC talks about this a great deal as well. And we're all very pleased about it. A couple last things, the next slide, that we still have left to do after the budget. One, workforce housing to try to make housing more affordable. Personal property tax repeal, the governor kept $200 million set aside in the budget so we could be able to fund the personal property tax repeal. We were so close. We came down to the last day of session, and I think only politics got in the way, but I feel very confident we'll be able to get that done. More money for rehiring and retraining of employees for small businesses. And the governor has a plan to do a $100 million venture capital fund which of course would make a big difference for helping our young and new entrepreneurs. Next slide. If Secretary Thompson were here, he would want you to know that in infrastructure, we have done just remarkably well. Over 1,700 miles of highways, 1,250 bridges have been fixed. It's almost unprecedented, the amount of infrastructure development that we've had. And the other item that I think personally I'm very proud of for our colleagues at DOT. And when I was in Congress, the way it worked, I was on the Transportation Committee, Federal Highways, they look at the end of the year at who has shovel-ready projects. And as the money is left for those that haven't been utilized, what they will do is they'll reallocate. So we brought in another $105 million because we had shovel-ready projects. And then finally, broadband, just vitally important in today's, in today's world. And we just had unprecedented, investment in, high-speed internet. Next slide. I always like to make sure that I cover, and if you don't remember anything else, please remember this. We get alerts from Homeland Security. We spend millions of dollars in the Department of Revenue to protect your identity, to stop people who are trying continually to steal your refund checks. So keep your firewall, malware, antivirus software up to date, because it's just vitally important in terms of protecting your business and protecting your information. Next slide. We've created a Badger unit, so I always like to just point this out for businesses that if you need extra help, something the governor encouraged us to do. Business Development Government Relations, Kathy Friedel heads that up. She's the one that helps us set up these web roundtables. And if you go to our website, if you Google Department of Revenue, BDGR, you can find all information about one-stop shops, tax incentives, workforce information. So we try to make it very easy for businesses to gather information. And then next, our research and policy division, all the slides you'll see here today from myself and from our economist, Emily Canfield. If you Google Department of Revenue, VIZ, you'll be able to access all of that. Very important for making decisions. And then just a couple last slides to preview what John Dickert's going to talk about. And that's about shared revenue. Shared revenue has been frozen for over 20 years. When we were discussing the personal property tax repeal, we talked about trying to make sure that we wouldn't freeze municipalities at the amount that they got. And many legislators said, well, at least have to come and ask us. I said, well, they come and ask you for 20 years. And for 20 years, every year, the answer is no. There's been no increase. So you can see that data point, which is remarkable. In 1999, there were $240 million in shared revenue. And here we are 22 years later, and there's less. So not only has it been frozen, it's actually gone backwards. So that's why I think you'll appreciate John Dickert's information. The last point, Joel mentioned this at the onset about a local option sales tax. The governor truly believes in this. He put it in his budget last time. You'll see it coming back. Now, you would have to have a referendum so the people would vote for this, that they would want a local option sales tax. But it obviously is very important. So along with this, and increasing share revenue by a significant amount, which the governor put forward just 2 weeks ago, is the governor's top priority. So last slide, just if in the end, we'll try to allow time for questions, but if you walk away and you think, oh, I have one more question, do not ever hesitate to email me at dorsecretary@wisconsin.gov. And we work very hard to get an answer in 24 hours. So thank you so much. Great to be with you all. And I'm going to turn it over to Emily Canfield, who is one of our top economists in our research and policy division. Emily, thanks for being with us.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit today. We're going to talk about, what's going on kind of right now in the national and also the Wisconsin economy. We'll take a minute and take a closer look at Milwaukee data. And after that, we'll kind of take a look at the outlook and what's coming forward or coming up for the area. First, I just want to highlight the Wisconsin employment report for September. This data came out last week. I'm not going to read through all of this, but I do just want to highlight that even though employment has increased over the past 3 months and for the past year or so, employment in September was still 1.4% below its pre-pandemic level. That's still about 43,000 jobs below where it was in February of 2020. So the state's got a little bit more room to go to recover. And we're going to see that here in this next chart. This is Wisconsin employment, the level. This is in thousands. And you can kind of see that it was moving slowly upwards until February 2020, and then by April 2020, employment had dropped by 404,000. Between April and September of this year, about 361,000 of those jobs have been recovered. That's about 89.2% of the jobs that were lost. And currently in September 22, employment is 2.95 million jobs for the state of Wisconsin. The private employment has recovered a little bit quicker than total employment, meaning that government is lagging, but private employment has recovered about 93% of the jobs lost. If we look at the sector level, the red bars here are the decline in April 2020 in employment by sector. You can see total employment fell by about 13%. Leisure and hospitality fell so far, it's not even on the chart, it fell about 50%. And then the blue bar is September 2022. And you can kind of see that there's 3 sectors that have already recovered, and that's construction, trade, transportation, and utilities, and then professional and business services. A couple other sectors, you've got manufacturing, information, and financial activities are really close to recovering, just about within 1%. And then the 4 sectors that are really lagging is education and health, and that's private education and health, leisure and hospitality, other services, which includes things like dry cleaners, car repair, that kind of thing, and then government. And then local government employment, including schools, is included in that government number, and that's still down about 5%. If we look kind of at the nation, this here is just a chart of gas prices. You can see this goes from 2019 through just last week, how much gas prices have really spiked. They were already increasing through 2021, and then in March or late February 2022, of course, Russia invaded Ukraine and prices spiked. The blue line here is diesel, and then the orange line is gasoline. And gasoline has fallen quite a bit. It actually peaked in June in Wisconsin at $4.92, and now it's at about $3.60. But diesel still remains quite a bit elevated. It's currently at $5.14 per gallon. So of course that's driving inflation, which is at the highest levels we've seen in over 40 years. Headline inflation was at 8.2% year over year in September. And then the big bad news here, I think, is the core CPI, which excludes food and energy, increased 6.6% over the past year. I think that was kind of a surprise. A lot of analysts were expecting core CPI to not be quite that high in the September readings. Food prices are up 11.2%, and that includes both food at home and food at restaurants. And then shelter costs, which is a really big component and is driving that core CPI number, that's up 6.6% year over year. Rent, as a subset of that, is up 7.2%. So renters are really being hit hard in terms of their living costs. Now, the inflation number is kind of interesting to me because it depends a little bit on how your spending is. If you haven't moved in several years and you own your home, if you haven't bought a new car in the past couple of years, your costs haven't increased as much as anyone who's, renewed their lease, moved in the past couple of years, or has had to buy a new car. Those people have really been subject to some sticker shock. Mortgage rates have also skyrocketed this year, and this is following unusually low levels in 2020 and 2021. Mortgage rates were as low as 2.8% 2 years ago, had risen just a little bit to 3.1% last year, and as of last week, we're nearly 7%. To give a little bit of perspective, if we go back 22 years, mortgage rates were at 7.8%, which was a little bit elevated, but not too bad. I think that the rates of the past 2 years has really kind of distorted the housing market and made home ownership cheaper, and so that has actually pushed up home prices. But the recent increase in mortgage rates plus the higher home prices has really made entering the housing market very, very unaffordable. If you look at buying the median home today versus just last December, so I mean, this is only 10 months, the monthly mortgage payment is 78% higher, and that's a combination of higher home prices as well as the much higher mortgage rate. So if you're just entering the housing market, it's really hard to get in right now. And of course, that's leading to this, which is that housing permits are absolutely tumbling. The yellow bars here are housing starts, but the blue line is housing permits, which tend to lead the whole housing market. And those have fallen for the past 6 or 7 months as demand has really fallen out of the housing market. All right, so we're going to change course here and look at some Milwaukee area data. We're going to go back quite a ways. This goes back all the way to 1975, and this is the share of state employment that is in Milwaukee County. In 1975, it was at 28.3%, which was more than a quarter of the state's employment, but that's fallen to about 16.9% in 2019. And the reason it's fallen so much is that in Wisconsin, employment over that time period has increased 80.5%, so it's almost doubled, but Milwaukee County employment has only increased 7.4%. So it really hasn't moved very far. And if we look at the next chart here, this is looking at the Milwaukee County in the red line and the whole 4-county MSA, which is Milwaukee, Waukesha, Washington, and Ozaukee counties. Milwaukee County's employment really hasn't gone anywhere. You can see that it peaked in 2000 at 530,000, which is actually just a tiny bit above its 1989 level. But currently in 2021, Milwaukee County employment was 13.8% below that peak. And what kind of happened is we'd hit a recession, employment would fall, but it just never quite recovered before the next recession hit, and then it would fall again. Now, the Milwaukee MSA, which is in the blue line here, and that's that 4-county area, it did see faster growth, but that was mostly in the 1980s and 1990s, and mostly driven by Waukesha County. But also Milwaukee County MSA, it's also struggled to regain its peak following the downturn, so its employment is not a lot higher than it was back in 2000. Now this chart here, this is just looking at the local, the recent data for the Milwaukee MSA. So that fell from about 870,000 in February 2020 to 756,000 in April. It was a decline of 120,000 jobs. The Milwaukee area alone was about 30% of the total employment lost in the state between February and April of 2020. Now it's recovered quite a bit of those jobs. About 91,000 jobs have come back, and that's about 75% of the jobs lost during the pandemic. So the Milwaukee area is lagging the state in terms of its recovery. So if we look at the breakout, like what do people do in Milwaukee County versus the state? The pie chart on the left is Milwaukee County, and on the right it's Wisconsin. And the way to read this is each wedge is kind of a share of the area's employment. So the orange wedge is business and finance. That also includes information and professional services. And in Milwaukee, it's about 24% of total employment. It's much lower at the state. It's at about 18% of total state employment. And then the gray here is education and health, and this is private education and health. So it wouldn't include your local elementary schools. And that's about 25% of total employment in Milwaukee versus about 15% for the state. Now the lighter blue color is manufacturing. In Milwaukee County, it's currently about 16%. I'm sorry, the dark blue is the manufacturing. So it's about 10% in Milwaukee County versus about 16.6% in Wisconsin. And just for reference, Wisconsin is actually the second state with the most employment in manufacturing. Indiana leads us by just a couple of percentage points. But if we go back to 1990, manufacturing was as much as 23.6% of employment in Wisconsin. It was about 19% of total employment in Milwaukee County. So that's really kind of fallen over the years as manufacturing has shrunk. Now, if we look at the forecast, we do expect employment to grow. This forecast is about a month or two old. And at the time, we were expected employment to grow a little bit through 2023. In this chart here, Milwaukee is on the left axis in blue, and Wisconsin's on the right. And the one thing to kind of note is that the Milwaukee County or the Milwaukee MSA is not expected to recover to its employment level, pre-pandemic employment level in the forecast. Now, if we do hit a recession, we're going to expect to see a bit of a decline in employment, both for Wisconsin and the Milwaukee MSA. Now, this chart is personal income. Personal income continued to grow throughout the pandemic, in part because of all the stimulus payments that were paid, as well as increased unemployment benefits. And that really drove growth in 2020. There are additional government transfers in 2021, and then that kind of waned in 2022, so personal income growth slows. One thing to note is this is nominal personal income growth. If we were adjusting for inflation, we would see a decline in personal income, both for the state and Milwaukee in 2022, just because the inflation rate is so high. Now this one here is wages and total personal income growth. Total is in the blue and wages is in the red, and this is just for the Milwaukee MSA. One thing you can kind of see is that they both diverge in 2020. You've still got growth in total personal income, which is driven by all the government payments, but wages actually declined because there was such a drop in employment. We're going to take a close look at retail sales. One thing that's kind of nice is we can look at retail sales on a monthly basis by county, because we do collect the county sales tax. And you can see that this is total retail sector. It was kind of growing around 5%. You've got Wisconsin in the red and Milwaukee in the blue, and this is year over year change. And it just kind of continued to grow throughout the pandemic, rising as much as 20% year over year in the middle of the year. And then the peak there was at about 24.5% in Milwaukee County. That was the first quarter of 2021. We saw a lot of people come out and spend money in especially March of 2021. We sold more cars, I think, in March of 2021 than we ever have. But if we look at restaurants, bars, and hotels, you can see that it really plunged in the pandemic, falling as much as 54% in the first quarter of 2020. And then it rebounded a year later when the economy opened up and people were able to get their vaccines and were comfortable going out to restaurants and hotels again. Now this here is a map of equalized values by county, and this is showing the percent of equalized values that are made up of residential. Wisconsin is at 72%, Milwaukee County is at 62.3%, and if we drill down, we can look at the city of Milwaukee, and that's at 56.4%. It's much lower than the state as a whole, and that's because of the high amount of commercial property that you see in the city of Milwaukee and also the county. And just for reference, apartment, like a large apartment building, that would actually count as commercial in the equalized values, whereas a home or a duplex would count as residential. So if you have a lot of apartment buildings, which we kind of do in Milwaukee, you're going to see that show up as commercial value, not residential. The next two charts are kind of similar, and I'm just going to skip forward one here. This is residential equalized values and the change year over year. The city of Milwaukee is in the green, Milwaukee County is in blue, and Wisconsin's in the red. And you can see that Milwaukee County and the city of Milwaukee really lagged the state, fell further during the Great Recession, and then was a little slower coming out. And over time, the city of Milwaukee only saw a 10% increase in residential values, whereas Milwaukee County saw 20.1 or 20.7, and Wisconsin increased 45%. I want to look a little bit at kind of what we're looking at. Recession odds are moving a lot higher right now. The probability of a recession in the next 12 months in a survey of economists has moved up to 63%. I know that the national forecaster that we use, they are forecasting a recession in their baseline scenario, and they have theirs starting actually this quarter right now, whereas a lot of economists, I think, are looking maybe 2 or 3 quarters out. So we have that kind of heading this way. The Federal Reserve, and this is part of the reason why we're expecting a recession, is poised to raise rates again. So the blue line here is the historical rates, and then the marks moving forward are kind of where it's expected to rise. So they're expected to raise rates. I think they meet again next week, and then maybe one more time before we see a decline. Now there are a couple good signs that we can look for in the economy. One thing is, even though housing is seeing a decline, we're expecting a small price decline, and housing permits are already falling. Housing is in a much better place than it was in like 2007. And there's a number of reasons for that. We just haven't seen the risky mortgages and the adjustable rate mortgages that we saw during the 2000s leading up to the Great Recession. There's not really a lot of evidence of speculation, which we saw a lot of 2 decades ago. Most homeowners are not underwater on their mortgages, and foreclosures are very low right now. They haven't seen any increase. And if we do see home prices fall, they're only going to wipe out recent gains. So maybe a gain that you've just seen in the last year or two. So most homeowners who have been in their home for more than 2 years aren't going to see a decline in their value in the long term. Some other good signs is that consumers are sitting on a lot of cash. A lot of it's payments that were received during the pandemic. And also because consumers saved so much, they weren't traveling, they weren't going to restaurants, they weren't going to sporting events. And so there's a lot of extra cash. That is kind of different by quartile. You can see this goes from 2020 quarter 1 to 2022 quarter 2. The top of the bar is like the overall level of how much money, this is in billions of dollars, is in savings right now. But most of that is in the top quartile in the yellow bars there. The bottom quartile doesn't have a lot of excess savings and has spent some of what they already received on their housing or higher housing costs and living costs. Even more good news, we haven't seen any increase in unemployment insurance claims. So those are still very, very low, and unemployment itself is very low. The employment rate's still in the low 3% for Wisconsin. Another thing that might help if we do enter a recession is that employers might be unwilling to let workers go even if they see a slowdown in their business. And that's just because over the past 2 years, it's been so hard to find workers. They're going to be really reluctant to let anybody go. One of Wisconsin's strengths, this is the labor force participation rate. You've got Wisconsin in the blue and the US in the red. And Wisconsin just has historically had a higher participation rate in the labor market than the nation. And so that's a good thing moving forward. And then another good thing for Wisconsin, and I don't have a data point on this, but Wisconsin is very concentrated in manufacturing. And if there is a lot of the offshoring that's been, kind of in the news and talked about a lot, Wisconsin's in a good poise to kind of take advantage of that. So that's it for me. You can get a hold of me just with that email address right there or through the secretary's office. So that's all I have, and I'll turn it over to John Dickert.
Thanks, Emily. Good morning, everyone. I'm John Dickert, the Administrator for Department of Revenue and State and Local Finance. Emily, stay with me. I'm just going to ask you to hit next on the slides, because we don't have a lot of time and we do want folks to have a chance to ask questions. So first slide, please. What we're going to do is start talking about a bit of the situation, is kind of where folks are and how that's going to impact where they're going in the future. It also is going to demonstrate how they are struggling today. And so I think the slides often speak for themselves. I'm not going to read through them. I'm going to let you do that because I know you can. But this is the problem, and in part, this is the problem, is that you have a large pension payment going out to the city and county, and that is not a service that the communities are providing. It's something that they're paying for, so it's not service-oriented. Services on the pension to the workers. Next slide, please. This is the scenario that we are in right now, which is basically in 2011, the aids were frozen. And I think you would all agree that if you're in a business and you were told that you're never going to make any more money than you did in 2011, things would be very difficult to deal with because costs continue to go up, and that never ends. All your costs go up at the local level, and some of them are much higher than you could anticipate going forward. Next slide, please. This is what you're seeing right now in just the base shared revenue. And because of that stagnation, you see the influx of taxes. Next slide. This is the difference that you would have if you would actually stay on a standard formula. So you can see the 85 to 95 to 98 trend, significant difference between the 217 million that would be coming into the city versus the 560. Those numbers alone demonstrate that there is a problem with this current scenario. Even if you halved that, it would still be at 367. So if you just use the modicum of inflation at a 3.5% increase, 396 is a great deal different than what you're dealing with right now with 217 million. Next slide, please. So this is one item that I think is very, very important to look at, which is if you just were to take the raw numbers, and the raw numbers of the 58 million in January 2003, and factor those in as real dollars today, it'd be worth $90 million to the county. Next slide. So what happens? Well, it's simple. This gets put on the back of residential taxpayers. You see the growth factors on everything else outside of commercial. There's a slight increase in commercial over the last 34 years, but really the impact here is on residential. So what happens? The property taxes go up. Some people now start having trouble paying their property taxes, can't afford their homes, and the issues continue. Next slide, please. You can see here it's obvious that you have higher property taxes in the city and the county, and you see the payments going down. This is not a sustainable future for anyone. And again, this just gets pushed on the backs of residential property taxpayers. Next slide. This is the net property tax levy. And once again, it's going up, not a sustainable platform at all. And this is where the weight of everything has gone since the amount of money coming in shared revenue and aids has been limited to local government. Next slide. Again, residential paying the largest portion, and this will continue. So that property class has difficulty, especially in the Milwaukee County area, where you have a larger percentage, as Emily talked about, of commercial properties. So that again, that gets added on to the residential property taxpayer. Next slide. This is unfortunately the outcome of what you see when you start capping aids to local municipalities. What they do is they turn to fees because this is all they had. And I know this firsthand because I started in 2009 and the levy limits started in 2011. So you turn to generate revenue because you're doing two things. Obviously, you're providing services, but you're also trying to provide quality of life issues because both of those things are attractive to the business community and they're the things that are required by the business community. So people turn to fees. So fee revenue has been going through the roof locally. So while the idea of the levy limit and the shared revenue limitations was to trim fat off local government, the fact is that happened in the first couple of years and the fat was gone. The reality is now what people are turning to is different revenue streams. And then the legislature came back and put a cap on fees as well. So again, we're seeing more difficulties with services. Next slide. The other portion that is really the other impact of this is that people have been going more towards debt. And debt levy, as you know, is not sustainable. It's not a good methodology or practice, but people have been using debt more because of the fact that they don't have the funds to sustain the current services that they're doing or providing any type of quality of life issues for their communities. Next slide. So what we see, if you can go back one slide, Emily, I thought we had, if you can see here, what the county did actually in 2009 and 2010 was they bought out some of their bond revenues from the state, which then helped in a decline in their bond revenues going forward. The city and statewide, people have not had that kind of forecasting because they've been using the debt primarily, just like I said before, to make sure that they're taking care of the quality of life issues. The difference in all of this, and we can go over the questions now, is that when you have nowhere to go, you have one of two options, which is you try to increase the revenue coming in, or you simply start cutting services, which you've seen. And when you get down to the point of cutting police and fire, which is the protective services that no one ever wants to cut, then you know it's pretty bad. What the county and the city are talking about with a sales tax and expansion in shared revenue are things that are not products that just provide additional fat for local communities. They're things that provide services. And from my example is when you have 67% of your whole budget is police and fire, Milwaukee County, obviously their big portion is their pension program. You really have nowhere else to go. So what happens is you either cut those folks or you just start limiting what you're doing for your services for your community. And that doesn't benefit any of us. So I'll turn it back over to the secretary in the gang and see if we've got some questions.
I don't see any questions in the chat, Peter. Here we go. There is a question about preparing for a recession. How does the department prepare for a recession?
Well, there's no good way to prepare for a recession, but what you do is you sort of look at the key indicators and you try to get a sense of what's the impact, if there is a recession. And as we analyze it, if there will be a recession, it appears like it will be mild. One of the big pluses is obviously from an employment standpoint, we feel that because we have, more jobs than we have people right now, that will buffer the impact of any potential recession. But obviously we analyze it as well from what's the impact on state revenues, local revenues, and how do we ensure that we put ourselves in the strongest possible position to, protect the interests of, state and local governments. Obviously, we'll try to coordinate very closely with WDC to make sure that there's funds available for private businesses and others, should we have, more of a challenge than what we normally might have.
Great. And if I think we're getting to the end of this hour, Peter, before I make any, okay, wait, we have one more question. We'll just answer this one. examples from other states that adjusted the shared revenue model that we're currently working to adjust. I think the shared revenue model in Wisconsin is a little, it's unique, I think, amongst some of our peer states, but you can maybe address a little bit of that before we close.
Well, that's true. I mean, each state is, that's one arena where each state is so unique in terms of how they do share revenue. And, for instance, we eliminated a video services fee about 2 years ago. And I know that one of the concerns that local governments had at the time is that we not freeze the amount going to local governments, but that's exactly what happened, which is unfortunate. So, but it really is hard to, I would say it's harder to compare shared revenue than probably any other arena. And then some of the other unique elements are, in Wisconsin, we have both, we have, expenditure restraint provisions, as well as, as well as other controls on local spending. So I would say compared to most other states, ours are very, very tight. And John Dickert, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, like the secretary said, all the states are different. What a lot of the states around us have seen is that there's been adjustments made. And the governor has come out recently with an increase in shared revenue, because as we've talked about earlier, when you start seeing cuts in protective services, then you're really at the bottom of the barrel. The other thing I will remind everyone is that we have communities throughout Wisconsin that don't have services to swaths of their counties. So some of them have reported that they're actually using sheriff's deputies because they don't have money for ambulances, sheriff's deputies to pick up individuals to take them to the hospital. That's not sustainable. That's not healthy. And I don't think that that's what Wisconsin's all about. And I think it's one of the reasons the governor has made the request for 4% and 4%.
Also, I do want to applaud the Greater Milwaukee Committee and the MMAC for, taking on this challenge and to have meetings with legislators in both parties and so that they can help to highlight the need. That's obviously very important.
And I guess, to finish, there's a question about how businesses can participate in this and what they can do. And I'll take that one and then, just give you a second to close here, Peter, if you want. But, really what we're trying to do is, and if there are a couple of people have asked about John's slides, and we'll make sure we get that information out to people. But to the greatest extent, if you look at the state shared revenue program, which is a contract that goes back to like 1911, all of those local taxes, all the sales taxes, all the income taxes are collected, sent to Madison, and then the contract was an equitable amount would be shared back to the 1,800 different local units of government around the state, and that's fundamentally broken. And John had a slide that said if it were just the rate of inflation, I think the city of Milwaukee would be getting an extra $150 million annually in shared revenue. And I think we can all agree that's not going to happen. We're looking for what are the other levers that we can pull on to potentially do that. And one of those, the one that we're focused on, is raising that revenue locally and then making sure that that revenue stays here to deal with those challenges that we have here as a local community. So how can businesses play a role? Make sure that you're continuing to stay informed. We will share more of this information, but there will be a full court press. There's an election that happens in 13 days, and regardless of what happens in that election, the city of Milwaukee and this coalition will be pushing for the ability to get that referendum and to kind of choose to make sure that we can raise that revenue here locally to solve some of those challenges. So that's where we will continue to be. And I really appreciate this, but I'll give you, Peter, the final word on this, and truly appreciate the work that you and your staff do and your help in this today. So I'll give you the last word.
Well, the last word would only be that we're in a strong position. So, when you're talking to legislators, policymakers, they can't claim poverty anymore, right? We've got $6 billion plus a rainy day fund, and it's money that should have been shared all along, in my judgment, with local units of government. To go 20 years without any increase whatsoever and actually to see a decrease overall, just speaks volumes. And I know in the last program that we did, somebody pointed out, well, state expenditures have gone up, but they don't believe local expenditures should. So I think you just have a very compelling case. And the good news is even if there is a mild recession, which hard to predict, we can't control what happens on a federal level, at least Wisconsin's positioned in such a strong manner, I think, to work our way through that. And of course, I have to say with the Badger bounce back and the goals that, Governor Evers has set, we truly want to be a partner and be there every step of the way to help, whether it's the private businesses, community-based organizations, and certain municipalities and counties. So thank you so much, Joel, for putting this on.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for joining us.